Three, two, one, we're live. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good day to everyone who's listening to this webinar. My name is Herns. I'm the Cloud and Enterprise Business Lead for Microsoft Philippines. And if you're a regular follower of our webinar series, this is our latest webinar entitled Azure Architecture Basics. So as the title has talked about, we will be covering some basic architectures on Azure that is normally deployed by some of our customers and what are some of the considerations that you need to take care of as far as basics is concerned before we deploy any significant workload on Azure. Just again, as a few reminders, this entire webinar is actually recorded. You will receive an email with the URL of the recording of this webinar. So once you get in that URL, you can listen to this webinar on demand. I don't believe you can download it, but you can stream it across your device as long as you have an internet connection. If you have any questions on any part of this webinar, just point that out in the Q&A window of your browser. So if you pop in those questions, I will try to answer some of them while the webinar is going on, or if I'm not able to do that, I can do it after the webinar, or you can send me an email. My contact details are there so that I can try to answer your questions offline. And if I don't know the answer to your question, then I'll definitely find a way to answer that, or at least find someone who will. So let's go on with the webinar. So today's title is Azure Architecture Basics. Okay, so whenever you go to deploy applications on the cloud, we'd have to make a decision on to which cloud model you want to choose. So probably as most of you would know, there are three models. You have infrastructure as a service, where Microsoft provides everything from the Microsoft manages and provides everything up to the virtualization and up to the operating system layer. But you then provide the operating system, the middleware, the data, the runtime, and applications to run on top of the virtual machines that we provide you. And as you know, we provide both Windows-based server virtual machines, or you can also create or deploy Linux-based virtual machines. On the other hand, you can also deploy applications and data on our platform as a service, or PaaS services in Azure. So in this notion, you only have to deploy the applications and the data, and we provide everything from networking to the data center all the way up to the runtime environment. And the only thing that you need to provide is literally the code and the data. And then you also have the SaaS environment. So a great example there is software as a service is Office 365, wherein you don't actually have to install anything. It's just a matter of configuration, creating your user accounts on Office 365, integrating it with your Active Directory so that users can log into the software as a to Office 365 in the SaaS model, and you don't need to deploy anything else. So when you list down all of your applications and determine which one would go to the cloud, it is inevitable that you'd have to make a decision on which model, IaaS, PaaS, or software as a service, do you want to deploy your application to. Now, Azure is actually a collection of multiple services. So this is kind of a not so good representation of what Azure is, because the number of services that are actually available on the Azure service is more than what is represented here. But I like using this slide because it kind of shows you what the categories of services that are available on Azure. So we have different services for compute, for virtual machines to containers, different types of storage, different types of networking capabilities. So if you combine compute, networking, and storage, that's when you start putting together your IaaS infrastructure, where you have virtual machines to run your applications on. On the other hand, we also have a myriad of tools for platform services, anywhere from media and CDN to integration services to compute services, wherein you only just have to deploy the code and to run on a runtime environment that's fully managed by Microsoft, whether it's mobile or web, application platforms, different developer services, even Visual Studio, and even open source developer services are available on demand on the Azure platform. Different data services such as SQL databases, managed SQL data warehouse, and so on and so forth. And all of these different capabilities are running across 54 different regions all over the world. So because this being an architecture basics webinar, We also have to be aware of the fact that Azure is a service that runs across 54 different data center regions. These are not 54 data centers, these are data center regions. Each region has anywhere between 2 to 3 data centers, and all of them are interconnected using vast majority of the interconnectivity is on Microsoft's own private network. And we also have peering locations and edge sites across multiple tier 1 and tier 2 telcos to allow our customers, such as you, to connect to Azure services using your local telcos in a faster manner. Now, remember the previous diagram where you have all these bits and pieces of Azure services? Well, to put them together, you create a solution. So when you go to the website called azure.com/solutions, you will actually see there are different ways in which Azure is used. So you can see there are examples of how it is used to deploy an IoT solution to solve particular business problems, for example, predictive maintenance or monitoring, how we use Azure to deploy SAP S/4HANA, how we use different Azure components to develop a blockchain-based solution to solve, for example, particular problems in business or particular issues in business that require blockchain, big data analytics, BI intelligence, and so on. So when you go to azure.com/solutions, you can actually get a reference architecture that kind of gives you an overview of the different components that are needed to develop, to deploy, or to deliver any of these solutions out there. So hence your job as an Azure architect, so to speak, or a cloud architect, is that thinking of Azure services such as a Lego set. So I like to use this analogy. So if you've, I'm pretty sure most of you in this webinar has already at one point in their life or even now are playing with Legos. So the way it works is that think of each Lego brick as a Azure service. So once you put together these Lego bricks to create something, like in the case of the picture, it creates a castle or it creates a car or trucks or vehicles or anything like that, you actually build a solution. So this is the full theme of this entire webinar. What are the different types of Azure services? How do you put them together to create certain types of solutions? And I will also be able to point out to you certain resources and how you do that. Once you build your solutions, you go back to the Azure portal, which is the main interface where customers or administrators start building more stuff on Azure to get more bricks. If you follow the analogy, create more solutions. So for example, so I liken that to going to the Lego store and buying more bricks so that you can build more stuff on top of Azure. Now, whenever you go to the cloud, more or less customers also always follow this generic journey. So whenever you take a look at whatever you have in your data center, you would have applications, you'll have data, and you also have infrastructure components, such as, for example, VMware virtualization environment. So whenever you list down all these applications and your data and your infra components, you'll have to make a decision whether you want to rehost that, refactor that, or re-architect it, or simply just dump the application and create a entirely new application, but this time making it cloud native, meaning it is created and born in the cloud, or just simply not create a new application or use the existing application and simply replace that with an application that's already running on some form of software as a service that's being provided for by other partners. So a perfect example here is, let's say you have an old email server that runs on Microsoft Exchange. So you can choose to rehost that application by simply creating a virtual machine to run your Exchange server on a new virtual machine. You can also dump your Exchange server and then just replace it with Office 365. So that's one example of this cloud journey. And whenever you go through this journey and as you classify applications across whether you do rehosting, refactoring, re-architecting, you can use virtual machines, containers, and different applications and services, but the common thing that wraps around them are security management. And in the case of custom-made applications, create a developer operations construct so that you can continuously improve your application over time. Now, this slide kind of talks about application innovation. So as you move your applications from on-premises to the cloud, it is not unusual that customers start with IaaS, because that's usually the easiest one, because your application already runs on a virtual machine environment that runs Windows or Linux. So you just simply, to use the term, lift and shift those virtual machines and run it on Azure. You can also use VM scale sets, which essentially are sets of VMs that automatically scale up depending on the extent of use by users. Now, once you've already had your applications running on VMs, then it may make sense to move the code of your applications away from virtual machines and run it on an app service. So an app service is, to give you an example, let's say you have a website. Okay, so normally when you run a website on the VM approach, is that you'll have to deploy the whole stack from database to application servers to web servers, etc. But on an app service, you don't have to deploy the full stack. You just simply get, for example, the PHP code and then run it on the app service. All the infrastructure that's required to execute that PHP code to render the website is already being done by the app service, and it is a fully managed service by Microsoft. You may also choose to containerize application and then use approaches such as the Azure Kubernetes services or open source Kubernetes to manage the lifecycle of the containers. Or you can do completely serverless, wherein you do not use any containers and just simply run the code as a service, such as using things such as Azure Functions or using Logic Apps. So using the very fabric of Azure executed through functions or Logic Apps to run specific applications. Now, whenever you have any solution that you run on Azure, you have to ask or at least uncover answers for certain specific questions that is aligned to the solution that you want to deploy. So some of them are pretty basic and some pretty there are some of them are pretty basic, or some of them are kind of common sense. Like for example, if you intend to use Azure for disaster recovery, say for example you have a situation where you've got multiple applications in your on-premise and you want to use the cloud as your DR site, whether it's a hot DR site or a warm DR site. These are the questions that you normally ask, like how large are the files that you want to copy? What are technology are you using now? So you may be, for example, using file backup or disaster recovery technology from any of our partners that can work on top of Azure as well. And you also have questions to ask, like how do you manage backup and DR of the file shares, and do you have the budget to expand the storage? If you're using Azure to do data migration, data center migration or consolidation, and this is a very common project across multiple customers. So imagine a scenario if you have multiple data centers and you want to use Azure as a consolidation point, as your central data center where you have most of the applications running on the cloud, but you still have some applications running on-prem on different data centers, but you would want to access those applications across via Azure. So, so questions would be the most common questions would be how many virtual machines, what are the operating systems are you using? Are you using Hyper-V or VMware? Because if you are using Hyper-V or VMware, there are specific tools within the Azure toolset for you to run VMware environments within Azure and Hyper-V as well. And also migrating. What is the timeline for you to migrate? If you're going to use Azure for dev test, you would have to ask questions such as what is the virtual machine capacity that's required by your dev test and your developers? What are your agile needs? Like, do you do roll forward or back continuous delivery? Do you want to use CI/CD and things like that? So either you create a dev test environment fully from scratch using open source tools running on VMs, or you just simply use platform as a service or dev test as a service, such as what we provide for in Visual Studio on Azure. If you're going to use, if you're going to run Azure to run ERP, for example, SAP, then you'd have to think about whether you want to build a separate dev test and QA environment, training environment, archive environment. SAP, Oracle, Dynamics, or any other ERP applications have specific virtual machine requirements. So for example, in the case of SAP, we have specific virtual machines types that were created that's running on hardware that is created specifically or acquired specifically to run SAP S/4HANA. Some other common scenarios would include, for example, if you want to use Azure to run your website, your mobile site, or to run media. Do you want to create a new app or a website? What are the capacity issues that are you facing in your existing website? What's the seasonality or the spikes of your mobile site? Like if you're a retail site, do you normally get spikes across certain months, like for example, Christmas? So you'd have to consider those usage spikes as part of your planning, because even though you're running Azure, which is a fully scalable platform, you can expand anytime you like. You still have to pay for that expansion, so you might want to be prepared. And then I don't want to go through all of this, but the whole point of why I went through all of this is that there are specific questions on each of the solutions that you want to run on top of Azure. And towards the end of this webinar, I'll show you the architectural diagrams or architectural guidelines on how to build these types of solutions and the questions that you typically need to ask before you start architecting those solutions on Azure. Okay, so data platform also, you have to consider data growth. What are your needs for security? What are your needs for performance? And what is your needs for availability and disaster recovery? All right, let's take care of a few fundamentals first. So let's talk about the scaffolding that's needed. Now, this is quite important because we teach our customers the need for these fundamentals to be put in place first before you go crazy and deploy anything on applications. So just like building a house, we need to have a strong foundation. Even before you think about how many bedrooms, or sorry, how many, or before you even think about what the color of the paint of your bedroom is going to be, uh, think about the foundations that's required for the house, because as you know, the house is going to last long. It's going to be very resilient against disasters if your foundation is strong and secure. So this is what we meant by now. What are the fundamentals or the building blocks for an enterprise grade cloud? So these are listed here: networking, role-based access control, or identity management, identity access management, subscription management, automation, billing, SLA and monitoring, backup recovery and migration, and security and compliance. So this is more or less the list of things that you need to take care of and solidify before we even start deploying the first virtual machine, or start deploying the first application on top of Azure. Because once you get all of these things right and you know how to do all of these things, then it's going to be easy peasy, and you don't have to go back to, because you don't want to fix the foundation while you're already occupying the house, if you follow the analogy. So first, let's talk about networking. So the first question always is usually, how do I connect my user or my data center to Azure? Because Azure is running on a public cloud. It's on a data center that is not owned by the company. It runs in one of the many data centers that Microsoft manages. So if you choose, for example, the Southeast Asia data center to run all of your Azure workloads and applications, physically that data center is located in Singapore. So how do you then connect your data center to Singapore? So there are many options for you to choose. One is the more, I don't know why I started with this, but the more expensive way to do this is to actually have a private connection. So this is literally a private international line between your data center to the Microsoft data center. This is called Express Route, and we have many providers that provide this Express Route capabilities, including PLDT and Globe locally. Now, once you already have your dedicated connection, you can not just only connect to Azure services, but you can also possibly connect to Office 365 services as well. The other way that most people use, especially if you're starting out, is to do site-to-site VPN. So it's literally a device in your remote site, a VPN device, or a firewall, or a web application firewall device, and an equivalent web application firewall device running on Azure. And then between these two devices, they create a secure VPN, virtual private network, across the public internet. So this is encrypted, and if you know networking basics in VPN, you know that this is going to be almost a private connection. The only difference is that you're running over the public internet. Now you'd have to choose which one is appropriate for you. So for example, almost all of our customers, or all of our customers, starts with VPN, and once the traffic between your data center and Azure increases, or if you have additional security or privacy requirements, then you can go to express route. Then you have to consider other stuff as well. So it may be a good point at this point to start planning your networking, because essentially you are extending your data center to a Azure data center, or to the public cloud. So it's essential that you include in the discussions your networking people who are experts in, for example, managing IP addresses, load balancing. How do you take care of DNS? Do you have to consider denial of service attacks? How do you protect against that? You may have certain standards on network isolation, network security groups. Let's say, for example, you may want to divide dev environments into dev environments and production environments, user groups or departments, and things like that. The next thing you have to worry about is role-based access control or identity and access management. So definitely what you need to do is that every user that runs an application on top of Azure needs to be authenticated, some more strictly than the others. So for example, the most common way that users use or does role-based access control is through Active Directory. It is assumed that most of you are running Windows Server Active Directory on-premise, and in Azure we have a service called Azure Active Directory. It's exactly the same as Windows Server Active Directory function-wise, and you can do synchronization. What essentially that means is that your your users and their access control bits from the Active Server Directory is synchronized with that of Azure Active Directory, so that the same users so you have the same users connecting to or authenticating whether the applications is running on-prem or on the cloud. So now, because you now have Azure Active Directory, you can then extend the same authentication mechanism across third-party um, third-party cloud services, because we support that, and also your own applications as well. You can also have additional identity providers, like for example, two-factor authentication, but that doesn't happen a lot nowadays because Azure AD also has multi-factor authentication. So think of a scenario where you log in using your username and password, but then you get challenged by entering your fingerprint or your Face ID using a mobile device. So that's already built into Azure AD as well. Now, you can also then get more customized as far as security is concerned. You can do something called identity-driven security. So for example, you can be more strict in terms of challenging users for their identity depending on, for example, where they are. So the most common scenario that I've seen is that if, for example, if I am a user that's trying to log into an application that's running on Azure and uses Azure Active Directory, and I try to access that application within the office premises, then I just use my username and password and then off I go. However, if I try to access the same application outside of the office network and Azure knows by the IP address that you are actually outside of the office network, then therefore two-factor authentication may come in. So the criteria as to when you use two-factor authentication or what have you can depends on, for example, the types of users, user groups, type of applications, and so on. We also have Azure Active Directory Identity Protection itself, which is a service within, which is a secure, one of the security services that's available specifically to take care of privileged access management. All right, now once you've already connected your data center to the cloud and you've taken care of authenticating your users and carrying over your access control that you've spent months putting together on premise to Azure, now it's time to look at your subscription. Now, every customer of Azure has something called a subscription. You have at least one subscription. Now, it may make sense in certain cases that you can have multiple subscriptions. You can have production subscription, a production subscription for test, and for subscription for dev. Now, if you don't want to have this, you can have one subscription. You can use a tool called Azure Cost Management to kind of meter the usage of each type of grouping within your organization as to how much they're using Azure services. Because as you know, Azure services are metered services. So you can meter the usage across multiple groups. But anyway, let's take a scenario where you have multiple subscriptions. You can have multiple groups, like for example, as is Illustrated in this diagram, you've got the network security team, storage backup team, a database management team, and they can have access to multiple subscriptions. It's up to you to control all of that. You can also have multiple user group attitudes, not attitudes, attributes, which are exactly the same as how you would manage users, devices, applications or access to applications on Azure Active Directory. You can also use the Azure Resource Management API. So think of the ARM or Azure Resource Manager as a place where you create templates of access control. Say, for example, I already have a user profile, for instance, that has access and read and write access or read access to certain resources within the Azure subscription. So I don't have to repeat the assignment of those access rights on different users. I just simply have a template and just use that template when I assign you. Now, once you've already got that in, you got to start thinking about automation. So like any other data center or any IT environment, there will be certain routine tasks that need to be done on a regular basis that it makes sense to automate rather than having someone do it manually. So what are the tools that you have that are available there? So you have PowerShell. So for those of you who know PowerShell on the Windows Server environment, that the same PowerShell language is supported and runs on Azure. We also have the Azure Resource Manager to deploy, to help you define templates and use those templates to automate deployments and upgrades easily instead of doing it one by one. So think of a scenario where, for example, a lot of enterprise customers have a standard dev server, which is of a specific type of virtual machine, specific number of cores, specific size of RAM, specific software that's installed, and so on. So every time a person asks or a user asks for a dev server, you don't have to recreate that same dev server. Since you've already defined that in the form of an ARM template, you just simply deploy the virtual machine using that template. And the third thing is Azure Automation. So Azure Automation is a set of tools within Azure that allows you to run scripts that you've created on PowerShell, for example, and then run these scripts on an automated fashion. So this can be anywhere between, so the use cases here be anywhere between scripts that can, for example, dump log files from one virtual machine to the other or anything of that sort. Okay, billing and cost management. There are two ways for you to take a look at your billing. So first of all, be familiar with the billing, with your billing cycle, like any other subscription service, the Azure. So if you're subscribed to the Azure service on a monthly basis, you can actually monitor your billing through the Azure portal. You can get a breakdown of the different services that you're using, how much of those services are you using, so you can anticipate how much you are going to pay for those services. So you can see it through your enterprise portal, or you can there is also something called Azure Billing Portal, which is it's a combination of data from APIs, from billing APIs to be displayed in the form of a Power BI report. Or you can use Azure Cost Management. So I'm using an old slide over here. I apologize for that. But this one right here, Cloudin, used to be a third-party service. So we've acquired Cloudin about a year ago. Now it's now called Cost Management. I'll talk to you more about that later on. Now, it is also inevitable that you have a environment which is a mix of different environments. So let's get real here. Not all of not all customers or not all partners would run all of their workloads in an Azure environment. In reality, this is what happens. You've got a mix of workloads that are running on premises, which may be in a mix of Windows and Windows and Linux servers. You may also have services that are running on the public cloud. And let's get real, it's not all Azure. Some of them may be on AWS or any other cloud provider. And you also have applications that run across a third-party hosting service, such as, for example, Rackspace, or you have your legacy server, or you have legacy agreements with PLDT and Globe, and some you have servers running on those data centers. How do you manage all of that? And the great thing about this is that in Azure, we have a set of tools centered around Azure Monitor where you can actually monitor your entire infrastructure, whether across multiple clouds, whether it's third-party cloud, other public clouds, or in your own data center, working hand in hand with Microsoft System Center to give you a single pane of management, a single pane of glass. So at the end of the day, this is kind of what it looks like. So the Azure Monitor capability, one of them is called log analytics. So it literally reads the logs of everything that you run on Azure, on AWS, on GCP, and in other clouds. So it uses AI to read the logs and then displays the what the logs are telling you in the form of a dashboard. So this is what it looks like. So this is a fully customizable dashboard, by the way. It'll show you, for example, which VMs potentially have malware, what are the alerts in specific applications or VMs or even physical servers that you need to be aware of, and so on and so forth. So it's a completely customizable dashboard. You can see this on the Azure portal. You can see this on an Azure mobile application that you can install on Android and iOS. So you can be on tabs and be aware of what is going on in Azure. One of the nice things about the log analytics service is that it also has a dependency monitor. So it can identify critical systems and you can view dependency maps on what other systems or databases or applications are dependent on a particular application. Now, Azure Monitor, as part of the scaffolding or the basics, if you will, you need to turn on monitoring because once you've already connected you've already established identity by synchronizing Active Directory. You've connected your data center to Azure via either VPN or ExpressRoute. You've managed your subscription. You know how to read your bills. You've set up Azure Cost Management. Now it makes a good idea to set up Azure Monitor. So Monitor is a suite of many tools that allows you to do these four things. One is to get a 360-degree view of your applications, infra, and network with analytics and dashboards. It is AI powered, so it can actually anticipate problems before they happen. It gives you intelligent insights that helps you resolve issues faster and make better decisions. It also does proactive optimizations. It can identify potential bottlenecks. So specific example you may be running, for example, an Oracle data warehouse on a virtual machine on Azure. It has the ability to read through the Oracle logs and gives you a warning, for example, if the Oracle database or data warehouse is now soon up to capacity and you have to fix it before it actually causes problems. So the monitor looks like this. And roughly on the right side, it is deeply embedded on the Azure portal. And again, this dashboard is fully customizable. You can choose the tiles that you want that can allow you to monitor multiple things that runs on Azure. It does from top to bottom on the right side, it collects data metrics and logs from both Azure and on-premises applications, operating system, network devices, virtual devices, and even anything that runs on AWS and GCP. Then it allows you to visualize this on a built-in dashboard so that you can easily visualize what's going on inside your Azure and in your heterogeneous environment. AI comes in to analyze, to give you end-to-end views across not just your infrastructure, but also at the application level. Also gives you the ability to respond, to proactively identify issues before they actually cause problems and response to alerts. And you can also integrate this with third-party ITSM or SIEM, or if you already have an existing SIEM service that does monitoring across your entire data center, you can also integrate this with that as well. So an example here is a monitoring solution. So I did a screen cap of an example where I am monitoring the health of Active Directory, whether I'm having any problems with my AD replication, if I have just a very high level insight on the number of requests and page views that I'm getting on certain applications. I'm monitoring how my backup is doing. I'm monitoring how many, if there are any active threats or malwares. And I'm also doing a specific, I'm also creating or used a dashboard to monitor network security groups data. So again, this dashboard is fully customized. You can also get alerts. Um, Now, in terms of setting up the alerts, most of the time our customers don't worry about that anymore because there are already templates that will help you determine what are the most important alerts for your particular for your particular environment. But if you want to create custom alerts, you may do so as well. Okay, sorry, this is a repetition. This is just another example of dashboard where in this case I am becoming more granular in terms of monitoring aspects of my applications and my security as well. If you want to read the raw logs, you can also do that. There is a view over here. So let's say you have an element in your dashboard that would ask you to monitor your containers. If you click through this dashboard, you can actually see the details here. And the data that you see here is specifically coming from the logs. Instead of just reading raw logs in a CSV fashion, it kind of reformats it in a much nicer looking format, so you can take a look at specific events within the logs if you're interested in that. Okay, so another great tool to turn on is something called the Azure Advisor. So think of the Azure Advisor as your free personalized guides to Azure best practices. So a lot of questions pop out usually from customers that ask specifically, how do I know if I am running Azure in an optimal manner? How do I know if I'm overusing or underutilizing certain resources? And where do I get help or at least advice on what specific services on Azure I should and should not use specific to the workloads that I'm running. So that's the job of Azure Advisor. Azure Advisor, by the way, is not turned on for by default, so you have to turn it on manually in the Azure portal. So it roughly does three general things. One is that it helps you optimize these resources for high ability, security, performance, and cost. It allows you to implement personalized recommendations with ease. So one of the great things about Azure Advisor, as the name implies, is that it gives you recommendations. You will see it later in the screenshots that the AI behind Azure Advisor takes a look at everything that you run on Azure and then gives you proactive recommendations on what to do in order for you to uh, reduce your cost of using Azure, strengthen the security of your usage of Azure, and several other things. You can also get best practice optimizations at no additional cost. This can be best practices that Microsoft has learned across multiple customers, or maybe best practices that the industry follows. And not only do we give you the best practice, we even give you things such as the scripts to execute to make those optimizations happen. And it does it across four different categories. High availability. So it will show you, for example, point out to you that, for example, if you have certain applications that do not have replication, that are not replicated on another region, which shows you susceptibility to downtime in case that application goes down. It'll give you an set of advices on how to strengthen high availability. Also give you best practices on security and how to better protect your Azure resources. So a common example here is that the Azure Advisor can actually tell you to encrypt a specific SQL Server data if, for example, it finds out that your SQL Server data base is not encrypted and is also serving confidential data. It'll give you advice on how to boost the performance of your application and responsiveness of your resource, and also cost optimization as well. So here's an example of one dashboard. So by default, it will show you the different recommendations across HA, security, performance, and cost. If let's say, oh, wait a minute, why do I have 20 recommendations for security? So on the portal itself, if you click on this dashboard, you will go to a more detailed dashboard that will show you what these recommendations are, and it's up to you if you want to implement these recommendations. In this example, 20 of them are high impact, so maybe you want to implement most, if not all of them. Cost management can also help you in terms of reducing your usage of the cloud. So, but not sacrificing performance or serviceability. So one thing nice about cost management is that on average, our customers see an improvement of cloud cost efficiency by 20 to 25% within 3 to 6 months of using the service. Now, it's not going to be immediate because over time, the AI behind cost management is sort of learning how you are using Azure at this point. So only about maybe 3 to 6 months will it start to give really sound recommendations on how to reduce your costs for Azure. Because, for example, across the 3-month period, cost management would notice that you're not fully utilizing your large virtual machine. So eventually it will make a recommendation to reduce the size of that virtual machine to something smaller so you can save a few bucks. Just as an example. You can monitor the cloud spend. You can track usage and cost trends. You can detect spending anomalies. Like this is the answer to questions from customers where they're asking, well, you know what? I have an Azure subscription. It's being used by multiple departments. I want to be able to track how much Azure services are actually being used by each department, and I want to put in a spending limit for each of those departments, and I want to detect some odd spending patterns. Like, for example, if one department is overusing a certain resource, I want to find out about it and also make a stop to that. And you can also forecast future spending, because a lot of our customers like to be able to be aware, or at least be able to predict how much they're going to be spending on Azure on the future, as they add more and more workloads on the cloud. And it's also displayed via a dashboard. You can see visualization such as cost versus budget, actual cost over, so on. Oh, sorry. Like, you can also drive organization accountability. You can allocate usage and cost to business units and projects. So, for example, if you know that your Azure budget per month is, let's say, $10,000, and that's a set budget, and you have a new project from one department, and you want to keep that particular group or project within $1,000, so that you within $1,000 budget every month. You do this here in cost management, and you can even keep track of it. You can produce chargeback and showback reports, so that large enterprises, for example, often like to charge back or do internal charging of services across departments. So you can generate those reports from here. Okay, so this is an example of a chargeback report. And you can also create alerts. So creative alerts, such as, for example, if there are certain resources that are unmanaged that are fired up, you can find out from here. You can also create a set of recommendations. It's very similar to what Azure Advisor does, but in this case, it makes recommendation from the standpoint of cloud cost optimization. It will make recommendations on virtual machine right sizing. It'll point out to you which resources are idle but are still running and they are being charged for, so you may want to turn those off. You can also improve virtual machine reserve instances management. So in Azure, you have the ability to reserve virtual machines. So for example, if you have a VM that's permanent that you're always using, you can actually go to the portal and say, I want to reserve this virtual machine for 12 or 36 months. And if you do that, you pay upfront, yes, but you will get discounts of anywhere between 30 to 8 to 50% once you start doing reservations. And cost management will point out which of your virtual machines would likely be beneficial from a cost standpoint if you start reserving instances for those VMs. Okay, so this is a graph that shows you what the purchase impact is if you start. Okay, so once you've already set up the monitors, the advisors, the Azure Advisor, and so on, and then you now start deploying stuff on top of Azure. So how do you then so depends on how you deploy the workloads. If you deploy your applications on platform as a service using web apps or mobile apps, for example, you don't have to worry about the backup anymore, because as part of the service, your code, it can be potentially be backed up, and it can scale across multiple data centers. Now, if you're running your applications on virtual machines, on the other hand, that's a different matter altogether. We do have a SLA for single for single virtual machines, but if you have an application that you would want to become resilient in case a virtual machine fails, or God forbid the whole data center fails, you have to set up resiliency between those virtual machines across multiple regions. And one way to do this is Azure Backup. So as an example, if on-premise you have Hyper-V, VMware, user machine, or laptop, PCs, or even applications, you can set up Azure Backup Server to do an encrypted backup on Microsoft Azure storage. The thing about here is that if any of these fails, you still have to recover that. You can also do virtual machine backups. You can use a service called Azure Site Recovery, which is using ASR to create snapshots of your virtual machines on-prem or from another region. So for example, if you have virtual machines running on the Southeast Asia region on the Singapore data center, you can use Azure Site Recovery to get snapshots of that VM so that it can be replicated to another region on Azure, say for example, the North America region. So in case something happens to your VMs in Southeast Asia, or if the Southeast Asia data center becomes offline, you can switch applications or users the over to the replica of that virtual machine on the North American data center. Okay, so here's an example to extend this example. So you have Azure Site Recovery. You can replicate your VMs from region A to region B. So in case, for example, something fails, you can easily recover your VMs from a VM level to region A or whichever region is still running. You can also use Azure Site Recovery to do disaster recovery across VMs running on physical data centers as well. So this is a very common user scenario where I have customers who have VMs running on VMware on an actual data center that they own, and then replicate that across Azure, essentially using Azure as their DR site. And you can also use it across multiple physical sites as well. And the site recovery service can work across Windows, Linux, SQL Server, even, and we have many customers who actually use Azure as their backup for stuff that runs on Amazon or on GCP, so that they don't run everything on a single cloud. So this is a very common pattern for disaster recovery. So you may have a server or servers on premise. You use Azure Site Recovery to replicate the virtual machine to a virtual hard drive, which is a type of storage in Azure. And then you have the SQL Server. If you're running SQL Server, SQL Server, as you know, has the built-in site recovery capabilities using ActiveSync or the HA or high availability capabilities within SQL Server to synchronize with another SQL database but running on a virtual machine. And then you'd use a service called Azure Traffic Manager where your users normally hit, and if Traffic Manager sees that the on-premise environment becomes unavailable, then they can switch over users to this environment. And you can easily recover your virtual machines for your VHB and run it on a VM, and your database is already in there because you're using the HA capabilities of SQL Server to replicate. Okay, so for security and compliance, there is a whole bunch of security capabilities within Azure. I don't want to go through all of this. You can just read through it during the recording, but be rest assured that all of the that Azure has the largest compliance portfolio in the industry. We outpace all of our other cloud service providers in terms of the certifications that we have that certify Azure services to run as secure. However, we also have something called Azure Security Center. So again, part of the basic architecture of running on Azure is to turn on certain basic services, including Security Center. So what does Security Center do? Think of it as your 24/7 by 365 AI-powered advisor service that constantly takes a look at the security standpoint or your security of of everything that you run on Azure, whether it's VMs, applications, or certain infrastructure components. So it's continuous security monitoring. It has built-in threats and detection alerts. It also works with a broad ecosystem of security solutions. So you can see some of them here in this slide. So it works with, not against, but with the other security products that you have across all of these other partners, which you may already have running on Azure and monitoring security for Azure as well. So here's an example of what Security Center does. If you turn on Security Center, the first thing that it will do is that it will read all of the security logs of everything that you run on Azure. It is also possible for you to get the security logs of on-premise as well. So it kind of extends Azure Security Center now into what is called we released a new service called Azure Sentinel, which is our cloud-based SIEM. But anyway, let's stick to Azure Security Center for now. If you turn on Azure Security Center, it will show you the health of your resources. What are the recommended things that you need to do to strengthen the security of everything that you run on Azure? And also gives you incidents. It'll show you the actual incidents. So for example, in this case, I don't know if you can read this. An incident has been detected, a database has been breached, and then the severity is high. If you use your mouse to click on that, you will actually see the details of that. And you actually see a threat map as to where the threat is coming from. And you get all these great security monitoring stuff in a single dashboard. Okay, but we don't stop there as well. We don't just show you the alerts, but we can also give you, the Security Center also gives you recommendations on what to do. So in this case, for example, it's recommending that you enable data collection, enable anti-malware for 7 virtual machines. It knows specifically what virtual machines are those and so on. Okay, so we have another tool called Azure Network Watcher. So if you have already deployed a environment on Azure that's kind of big, for example, you have multiple VPNs, multiple virtual networks, and so on. Sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes the problem is how data traverses within your Azure virtual network. So you would need to have some sort of network sniffer to look at the specific packets that go from one application to the other in your Azure environment. So this is what Azure Network Watcher does. It gains insight to your network using flow logs. It uses remote network monitoring with packet capture, and also diagnoses VPN connectivity issues. Not just VPNs from your data center to Azure, but also VPNs to multiple Azure subscriptions. If in case you have multiple Azure subscriptions, and in case you have multiple applications running across multiple subscriptions connected via VNets. Service Health, aka.ms/Azure Service Health is an easy URL to remember, is actually built into your Azure portal. Now, one thing I should say is that even if you're running on Azure, it's not always going to be 100% perfect. It's not always going to be up all the time. There are certain instances where certain services becomes unavailable or becomes inaccessible or it becomes slow. So if you notice, for example, that say, for example, your website response is getting slow, one of the first things that you might want to do is check your Azure Service Health first to see if there is any services, or let's say the web app service is unavailable or is being fixed, or there's a problem that is none of your fault. It's actually Microsoft's fault, for example. You can see in the Service Health whether you are affected by that outage or not. Because it's a personalized dashboard, you can set up target notifications. Like for example, you can get your web team to be alerted if your website is down, and so on. You can share details and updates easily. You can also receive guidance and support to help you diagnose certain issues. This is how you turn on Service Health within the portal itself. You turn it on, and then start monitoring your service alerts. Okay, we also have an Azure mobile app. So this is again part of monitoring. You can install this on your iOS or your Android device. And what you can do here is you can you have a mobile version of the portal, so you can literally administer your Azure subscription and Azure resources from a mobile device. You can run PowerShell, you can stop and start certain services, you can even deploy some services by running an ARM template from the mobile app. Okay, now we also have to be aware that there are a lot of services within Azure that are PaaS, or platform as a service. So this includes web and mobile, data and storage, analytics, IoT. So we don't have enough time to cover all of that. But just be aware that it is not all about IaaS. normally use the cloud, or you should not normally use the cloud just to run virtual machine storage and networking. As much as possible, may want to use platform as a service, PaaS services, such as, for example, container services, cloud services, or service fabric to run serverless applications, or even app services such as API management, managing connectivity between applications using a robust API management tool, running applications using mobile app service, or running applications on the web, running the web app service. And always remember that Azure is an open cloud and it's a rich ecosystem. We support more open source platforms than other cloud service providers. We have many customers who run pure open source on top of Azure, but the same architectural basics, if you will, that we have covered in the last how many minutes rings true whether you deploy open source applications on Azure. So whether it's DevTools, DevOps applications, app frameworks, databases, infrastructure, and so on. Okay, so I want to walk through very quickly on some hybrid cloud scenarios. So if you have, we have an appliance, well, we used to call it Store Simple, now it's called Azure Data Box Edge, where you can use it as a gateway for storage on the cloud. So you just simply connect this device in your network, and then once it's connected to your network, you can start mounting it as common storage like a NAS across your multiple virtual machines or your applications on premise, and then start replicating volumes to the cloud, whether it's SharePoint, SQL Server, or an application environment on Azure. Now, it is also inevitable, and be aware of this, that there will be some components of your Azure infrastructure that will come from the Azure Marketplace. And this is the location wherein you can get ISV solutions from the marketplace. So for example, in Azure, we actually have a lot of first-party services. So one example there is a web application firewall. So before Microsoft actually released the Azure Web Application Firewall service within Azure, a lot of our customers have already been using firewalls from people like what you see here in front of you, Barracuda, Fortinet, Checkpoint, etc. How do you deploy, for example, a virtual F5 WAF in Azure? You get it from the marketplace. This is where you buy it, and this is where you get the images of that firewall, so you don't have to install it from scratch. You just simply deploy it on a virtual machine from the marketplace, and off you go. So here are some examples of Azure reference architectures. I know that we spent a lot of time discussing the basics, but I want to show you some examples. So a reference architecture is proven practices based on successful customer engagements. We internally call it a golden path. So it's like a template of architecture that you would normally follow as a basis of how you deploy certain solutions or certain approaches on Azure. Okay, so there are ARM templates available for each reference architecture, so you don't have to start from scratch. The templates are already there. And it's now also available for IaaS, PaaS, hybrid, and identity. So if you go to aka.ms/architecture, you will see many examples of different types of architectures on Azure. So let me go through some of them quickly. So this is what the Azure Architecture Center looks like. So it is under Microsoft Docs. You can see here, I want to point this out, some examples of typical architecture of how to deploy AI machine learning, data architectures, high performance computing, IoT services, networking, and so on. So all the documentation is there and all the diagrams are there as well. So here's a reference architecture for IaaS. So you can see examples, for example, of a single box IaaS, wherein you have disk networking and diagnostics involved, multi-virtual machine IaaS infrastructure, multi-tier IaaS infrastructure, and also multi-region infrastructure. So as you move along from left to right, you will notice that you will need more and more services. So for example, if you move from single box to multi-box, because your application is now deployed across two different virtual machines, you will then need to use a load balancer. You will have to configure your applications on top of what is called an availability set or a scale set. Now, if you have multi-tier applications, meaning, for example, you have applications that are web-facing or user-facing, and you have an application layer and you have a data layer, you'd have to subdivide these three tiers into multiple network security groups, and therefore you will need network virtual appliances, start worrying about subnets, and how to configure SQL always on, in this case, if you were using SQL. If you were going to do multi-region, meaning your application that is multi-tiered is now deployed across multiple regions for resiliency and scalability purpose, then you would have to use, again, traffic manager, a VPN gateway, database, start worrying about database replication, or if you're using a SQL managed instance, you don't have to worry about this anymore. So that's another consideration, and so on and so forth. So those are examples of reference architectures for IaaS that you can see on the architecture on the architecture site. Another great reference of solution architectures is this URL right here, azure.com, whatever. So remember when you go to azure.com, we talked about in the beginning of this webinar, you have solutions. So here in the Azure Solution Architecture site, you can see several examples of architectural approaches or templates, if you will, of different solutions. So if you want to build infrastructure or architecture for backup and archive, blockchain, DevOps, and whatever you see here on this dropdown, you make a selection and the architecture diagrams and the links will will show you all reference architectures that are specific to what you have what you have picked here in the solutions dropdown. You can also choose solution architectures that are specific to products. Like for example, if you already know that you want to deploy a web-based application, a web application, for example, that uses MySQL as the backend database, but using the MySQL managed service, you can just select here Azure Database for MySQL. And then once you make that selection, the diagrams that will show here in the dropdown will be specific to MySQL. Can check according to tags if you want to. So our servers, operation management, and we also even have some reference architectures to typical solutions that are used for financial services, manufacturing, retail, and other industries. That's a lot of content. I know that we're over time, but I also still want to make sure that you are aware of this. There is a free ebook called Enterprise Cloud Strategy. So even before you start deploying or subscribing to Azure, you may want to start thinking about what your cloud strategy is over time. Build your cloud adoption framework. So it's a free ebook. This is a very well written book. You can download it for free. You can read it. It will start helping to shape and to help you lead your journey to the cloud, and also discover what makes the cloud so compelling to enterprises. Some of them are basic stuff, so you may want to use some of the content here to justify your cloud projects to your decision maker. But it also then quickly goes down to the architectural level. And what you have learned in this quick webinar, and as far as architectural approaches and what basics you need to build your Azure infrastructure, will also be covered in this book. All right, so we are at the top of the hour of the webinar. We're going to slightly go over time. I apologize for that. But I wanted to make sure that I mentioned a few things before we end the webinar. First of all, you can still get your Azure free account. You can go to azure.com/free. You will get, once you register for this, you will get $200 of credit that you can use across multiple different Azure services and start experimenting with Azure. There are certain services which are free, but these are the different services that will be, as long as you don't go over the limits of all of these services, your $200 credit remains intact. Once you go over the usage limits of any of these services, then it starts debiting from your $200. But once your $200 almost is zero, you will get a friendly reminder in your Azure portal and via email to ask you if you want to continue on this service by charging your credit card. And these are all of the services that you will use for 12 months for free, and it will not be credited against your $200. A lot of people ask me where you get training. So everything you can get from Microsoft Learn. So you can go to Microsoft Learn, select Azure training, and you can select training according to your role. So if you are aspiring to be an Azure administrator, AI engineer, data engineer, so make a selection from the drop down, and all of the training that will be displayed here will be curated according to the role that you have just selected. So the content can be anywhere between video content, written content, source codes from GitHub, or links to source codes in GitHub, lots of reading to do, and also lab exercises as well. I know of a lot of people who actually use the training material here, not just to learn how to make things work on Azure, but also prepare themselves for Azure certification, which is now starting to become um, a requirement for a lot of our customers and our partners. There's a specific school just on AI called AI School. It's called aischool.microsoft.com. This particular section of Azure training will help you, from a technical standpoint, help you build chatbots, help you understand what are the different AI services to make your application smarter, to be able to use our cognitive services to, for example, speech to text, how to incorporate text to speech, visual character recognition, OCR, AI-driven OCR in your applications, and so on and so forth. There's also a section called AI Business School. This is a great resource for your business decision maker to be educated on what AI is all about and how to build an AI-friendly culture within corporate and also government environments. Complete documentation is on Microsoft Docs. Just go to docs.microsoft.com and you can make a selection on Azure. All the documentation is there. A lot of the URLs that I just mentioned in the webinar actually points down to docs.microsoft.com. Thank you very much for spending more than an hour. Unfortunately, I went over time. I apologize for that. It's a big topic, and I really just wanted to cover all of the basics first so that when you start reviewing this webinar again or stop at a certain point, you can have the resources and the links. Just follow all of that. And I hope this sparks your interest in becoming a full-blown Azure solution architect in the future. We want to start everything by teaching you the basics of what is required for a really enterprise class Azure deployment, similar to what our biggest Azure customers, such as Walmart and other local customers, have done. So thank you very much. Again, this is Herns. I've been your host for the past hour or so. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions or if you have any comments, just send me an email at hrmedia@microsoft.com. All right. Thank you very much. Goodbye, and see you at the next event or webinar.